Hey everyone, how's it going? Olian here, and we're gonna take a look at how to recreate this nice synth sound from Stranger Things, from the theme from Stranger Things. So let's jump right in. It's pretty much a pretty easy sound to make, but there are a few basics you have to know about synthesis in order to kind of be able to play around with the sound and shape it in a way that you want to. So yeah, let's go over that. I'm just gonna initialize the patch in Silent real quick. Actually, I'm going to do this in Silent, but I'm going to explain it in a way that you can pretty much recreate it in any synthesizer of your choice, since it's a pretty easy sound to make and it only uses pretty basic techniques, which means you can recreate it definitely in any subtractive synthesizer. So yeah, the way you start out is basically you're going to use two oscillators, which means you're going to be using two different waveforms, and the waveforms you're going to use are going to be a sawtooth wave, which it looks like, well, like a sawtooth, and you can choose in Silent, you can choose that over here, but yeah, in other synthesizers you might open like a little table window or something like that, and then you can pick the saw. And then we're going to be using a pulse wave, which in some synthesizers might be called a square wave. Yes, and actually we're gonna use one voice for each. In some synthesizers you don't even get the option to choose different voices, but yeah, in this one you do, and we're just gonna choose one, and we're actually gonna drop the saw wave, the square wave, by 1 octave, which means we're gonna have the saw wave on top and the square wave on the bottom to kind of create our basic sound that we're then gonna shape. That sounds like this. I'm actually going to turn this down for a second. So pretty harsh and stuff. So the things we're going to do with this thing is now, first of all, we're going to turn it into like an arpeggio. And I'm going to explain to you the notes which you have to play for this arpeggio to create the line of Stranger Things. And we're going to shape the sound with two things, basically. First of all, the amp envelope, which kind of just controls the volume of this overall sound over time. And then we're going to control a filter. A filter just kind of cuts out some frequencies from this basic building block that we now created with these two waveforms. And we're going to use a low pass filter, which means we're going to be cutting the high frequencies out. Okay. And with this cutoff over here, you can now decide at what point do you want to start cutting out the high frequencies. And you can also obviously change that over time in order to, well, change over time how much high frequencies you want to have or don't want to have. Pretty sure you find that very easily in your synthesizer as well if you're not using Silent. In order for us not having to always control the settings of the filter ourselves, we can also use something to modulate it, and you call those modulation envelopes, also available in any synthesizer really. And there must be some way to be like choosing the thing that you want to control with the envelope. In our case, we want to control the cutoff of the filter. And so now we can choose an envelope in order to, well, yeah, create the movement of the filter that we want. So that's basically already the basic setup. What I also decided to do, just because we're listening to the sound on ourselves and stuff, is put a little bit of reverb on top, but nothing specific, just like something really random. Probably you have some effects in your synthesizer and you can just throw a bit of reverb on top just to make it sound slightly nicer. And then later on, if you actually want to make a track with it or something, you can obviously fine tune the reverb and this kind of stuff. So yeah, this is the basic building block. And we're going to start with a cutoff like around the middle, so we don't have anything too harsh. So we have this sound right now. So now let's actually work on those envelopes, because we want to kind of create a little shape in the sound. My approach was actually the following. The sound in the theme song itself sounded relatively percussive. So I started out with an amp envelope which doesn't have any sustain and just has a bit of decay and release. And since it sounded kind of like, I don't know, I saw another video where they kind of recreated a sound like this on a Juno analog synthesizer. And what I know about those is that they have one envelope only, which you can use for the amp envelope as well as for the filter. So I thought, okay, to start out, I'm just going to use the same settings I'm using for the amp envelope for the modulation envelope as well. So I made it more or less the same. And in Silent, what you can also do, you can just copy and paste the settings so they are exactly the same. Okay. What I also did in the initial preset, or in the preset in the preview, that I just added some warm drive and a bit of drive over here, which is basically kind of some analog distortion. And since, well, the soundtrack itself is probably, I mean, or pretty surely made with like some kind of analog synthesizer, modular synth, something like that. And I mean, Silent is a plugin modeled after an analog synthesizer, but you can still maybe with some distortion make up for some of the character that's missing in the sound and some of the perfectness of these very clean and sterile waveforms. But that's all like kind of optional stuff. So at this point we have a sound like this. So before we do any more fine tuning, let's actually get into the arpeggio itself. So the notes are pretty simple. You're going to be playing a C major 7 chord and adding the C in another octave on top, which means we're going to be playing a C, an E, a G, a B, and a C. And then we're just going to go up and down in those notes. So if I'm playing that, okay. And you probably have an arpeggiator or sequencer option in your synthesizer, which means you can definitely play around with that in order not to have to always press every single key and actually play it out. If you don't know how to use that, or you don't have the option, or you don't want to use it, you can obviously create a MIDI file and loop it, which is just playing these notes over and over again, basically playing it C, D. But you can also use the arpeggiator. My approach in this case was actually using the arpeggiator in up and down mode, which means the arpeggiator, whatever notes you're pressing, it's going to start on the bottom, go up, and then go down. Which means if I'm now holding down these keys on the keyboard, it's actually playing it like that. And since I also found it kind of annoying to have to hold down all these keys all the time, I simply decided to use a chord MIDI, how you call those, MIDI effect in Ableton, which means I just have to press one key and it's automatically translating that into a chord. And the way you set this up is just adding like this structure that I explained, the major 7 with the octave on top, which means you're basically on top of the note that you're already playing. You want to play, or you want to jump 4 semitones, then 7 semitones, 11 semitones, and 12 semitones, which is the octave. You don't have to do it this way. You can also use a step sequencer, which Silent also has, but it would take me a bit longer to set that up. So I just went for this option. But I know in Massive and also here, you can basically decide what kind of notes you want to play, so you can kind of create the chord in here instead of having to play it. That's also an option, but not necessarily that interesting for this video. But if you want to try out how that works and get to know your synthesizer more, definitely go for it and find out all the stuff. This might be good exercise to work that one out. So yeah, I have the chord function now. I have the arpeggio set up. It sounds like this. Then here you can set the tempo. An 8th note seems fine for me at this very moment. I set the project BPM to 170 and then chose an 8th note as an interval, but I'm not exactly sure what the original or what the tempo of the original soundtrack is. but you can kind of mess around with picking a tempo and picking a project BPM, which kind of gives you the tempo that you feel like. And then in Silent you have this gate option, which kind of acts some has an effect on how long those notes get, and if you kind of cut off the notes at a certain point. So somewhat a similar effect as a decay and a release and this kind of stuff have on an envelope. So let's check that out for a second. You can hear the notes getting longer, slightly. So the fact that here isn't that big in this example, but I just thought I'd mention it because I actually added a bit of, I opened up the gate a bit more. So yeah, let's finally fine tune it. So from this point on, we can now make decisions on how we want to set our initial cutoff and how much we want to, or how we want to set the release and decay, and also the modulation amount, because at this point we're not actually adding any modulation yet. So in order for it not to be too bright all the way immediately, I'm going to turn down the cutoff frequency, which means initially we're cutting out more high frequencies. So it sounds kind of dull and quiet. So when we now open up the modulation, okay, now I'm actually going to play one note lower. I'm going to adjust my keyboard. And what I also did in the original preset is kind of play between the volumes of the square wave and the sawtooth wave, and I actually turned down the volume of the square wave just to kind of get the sound that I was looking for. Makes it sound slightly, slightly different. So what I'm doing here is I'm changing the modulation depth, which means what the filter does is basically start at a certain point and with like a lot of high frequencies cut out. Then you jump to a certain point that you set with the modulation amount, as in like you jump to a different cutoff frequency that's higher, and then you start falling, like the filter is moving towards the point which you initially set in the time that you set with the decay, okay? And then the release, what it does is if you stop pressing the key before the decay time is over, then the release time starts kicking in. Just as a little background, maybe you know enough of synthesis to kind of know this already, but just for those out there who are maybe very new to this and would like to hear some more about that. So yeah, so what you can do is basically modulate or change the modulation depth, which means how many high frequencies you want to let out. So you can start out, for example, with like not that much high frequency stuff. Yeah, instead of that, you could also technically move the cutoff of the filter. Those are going to be slightly different effects, because in one case you're actually moving the whole filter up, which means the moment you move the cutoff filter, the modulation stays the same. It still goes higher from that point on, which means the point to what the filter gets before it starts going down gets raised, but it doesn't go all the way back down to the point you set initially in your filter. So the difference between changing this knob compared to this knob is that in one case you're kind of moving the whole filter, while in one case you're only moving the maximum of where the filter goes. I hope that's kind of, yeah, that's understandable. And obviously, if you want to play around and create your own sound and just use this as an inspiration, you can play with the resonance, this kind of stuff. If you say like, hey, I don't want to be moving around these knobs at all, I want to touch as little stuff as possible, you could also use an LFO and be like, hey, I'm actually gonna modulate the modulation depth of the envelope. I'm not sure completely if you can technically do that in Silent, but maybe not, but you can probably modulate the cutoff itself, for example, and then have that changing around. And okay, no, but too bad. Like that's sometimes you're sometimes limited, and maybe in another synthesizer you can actually do that. So you might be able to modulate the modulation depth. But in this case, I don't think so. But maybe yes. I'm gonna have to take a closer look. But so far so good. I hope you liked the tutorial and you learned some stuff about synthesis. If you have any questions, feel free to write them in the comments. If I went over some stuff too quickly, I'm going to be happy to make another video or slightly more intro video to synthesis if you have any questions and stuff like that. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, have a good one, and I hope to see you around in some of my other videos. Peace.